The House of Commons is back in session, and no surprise, the We Charity controversy dominated question period today.
A group of people set up an organization with a charitable wing that receives money from the taxpayer. That same organization sets up a for-profit corporation that charges the charity for, quote, services. At the same time, the charity and the for-profit are gobbling up tens of millions of dollars worth of prime Toronto real estate, all the while giving a platform and endorsements to the politicians who approved the grants in the first place. Now, this isn't a plot line in a Sopranos episode, Mr. Speaker. This is the Prime Minister's current scandal. So will the Prime Minister show up at committee and testify?
Will Deputy Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, the nonpartisan public service recommended this structure as the only way to deliver the program in the required time. Obviously, the way this unfolded was regrettable, and that is why the charity is no longer administering the project. When it comes to the committee, we are cooperating with it as we ought to do.
The back and forth in the House of Commons is making a dent outside of Parliament as well. A new poll out today is showing that the Liberals have dropped 4 points nationally since late June. A bit of a recap. The government agreed to use the We Charity to administer a student grant program worth $900 million. Then it was revealed that charity had links to the Prime Minister and his family. In fact, together, the Prime Minister's mother and brother were paid nearly $300,000 in speaking fees by We. Now, Justin Trudeau has apologized for not recusing himself from cabinet discussions around the decision, but he's still facing his third ethics investigation. So let's bring in some experts on the numbers to help us discuss. Shachi Kurl is the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. She's joining us from Vancouver. David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data, the company that had that poll out today. And Éric Grenier is the CBC's polls analyst. They're all, the last two are joining us from Ottawa, I should say. Hey, guys, great to see you.
Hi, Vashi.
David, I'm going to start with you because those numbers out today are from Abacus. Let's start off with that headline, the drop in support since late June. Can you delve into those numbers a bit for us?
Yeah, so we finished the survey last week, and what we found was that if an election were held at the time of that survey, the Liberals would get 36% of the national vote, 5 points ahead of the Conservatives at 31 and the NDP at 16. But where the story is where those numbers are headed, and they're headed down from a high of our polling at 40% last month. So a 4-point drop within a month is something we don't often see. We actually have had pretty consistent numbers for the Liberals over the last number of months as a result of the goodwill that they've generated in response to the pandemic. But when we go a little deeper and we try to understand, why that might be happening, the evidence from our survey suggests the We Charity controversy is likely a big factor in explaining that drop.
And just quickly before I move on to Shachi, what is it about the evidence that you're seeing that points you in the direction of We? Like, what is the answer being given that you're going, okay, that's probably the reason why?
Yeah, the first thing is the level of attention people are paying to this issue is, when I was looking back at our tracking during the SNC-Lavalin controversy, it's about equivalent. So anyone who says Canadians aren't following the news this summer, that's not true. We're in the midst of a pandemic, so there's lots of attention being paid to news and watching programs like yours, Vashi. But more important is when we ask people, how do you think the government's handled this issue? Of those aware of it, over half say they've done it poorly, including 40% of those who voted Liberal. So, the sense is that this has not been handled very well by the government. And even more important, more people believe this is an example of an attempt to help friends with public money, as opposed to a procedural, problem, trying to get the money out quick and not doing due diligence. So there's a sense that something's wrong here, and certainly that most Canadians don't believe the government's handled this very well.
So Shachi, we last spoke to you when you had done some numbers, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was right after the revelation, basically, that you did your polling that the Prime Minister's mother and brother had been paid, because that sort of changed the dynamics of the story. What is your sense of what you're hearing today? Does it match what your early polls were telling you?
I think it follows the trend. So I think the numbers and the data that David's come out with today certainly tracks and continues on a line that shows, as we had managed to find just in the very quick aftermath, as the news was breaking, as we were dealing with the first couple of days of headlines, that people are engaged, they're paying attention, and this scandal serves to remind them of scandals past. So whether it's SNC-Lavalin and problems with process and ethics, or whether it's issues around, vacationing on the Aga Khan's Island, this is just another demonstration of what has been, I think now, a fairly indelible perception that many Canadians have of the Prime Minister and of his government as one that, may align with their values or their priorities on a number of fronts, whether it's the environment or social values or indeed the way they've handled the COVID crisis, but at the same time seems to play fast and loose with rules and doesn't do a very good job following them all the time. And so then the question, Vashi, becomes, how damaging is this? Because we've already seen the Prime Minister survive quite possibly the most damaging, devastating example of it, which was the SNC-Lavalin crisis. So does We Charity scandal have the potential to grow into something similar at a time when now the Liberal government doesn't have a majority, doesn't have the same kind of power that it had at the committee level or in the Commons that it used to? Or do you get a point where Canadians have largely pulled to their corners on the issue? Those who are going to be angry about it and withdraw support over it have done so, and the rest who are going to stick with them just say, well, we might not like him, but he's our guy. We might not like what he did, but he's our guy. That's the known unknown at this time.
What's your sense, Eric, of that question? Because I do think it's important. If I think back to SNC, by the time about a month of that had played out, people had sort of made their determinations, and it didn't really change much beyond that. What is your sense in this instance, Eric?
Yeah, I think the big question is how long this could last if it continues. David's new poll out is the first sign, a real sign that we've seen that the Liberal Party itself has lost support, probably related to this. Will this be something that lasts for weeks to come? First of all, do we see other polls that also pick up a similar movement? If that does happen to the Liberals, then they would certainly be in some trouble. If instead we do see that maybe they've lost 4 or 5 points, that some of the goodwill that they built up during their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic goes away, but they plateau somewhere around 35, 36%, then that is the kind of number that maybe more reasonably the Liberals would have been expected to be at before the pandemic began in the first place. They would take those kinds of numbers. Certainly, they'd prefer to be at the 40% or plus that they were just a few weeks ago before this controversy. But it's really just a question of the lasting power on this, because the thing that has saved the Liberals in the past is that a lot of Canadians tend to already have a well-established view of Justin Trudeau. And for the people who don't like him, this is just another reason not to like him. And for the people who do like him, they're much more likely to find excuses for it. In David's poll, there was a question that, was this a sign of giving advantage to friends, or was this more of an ethical and just a bad decision? There's a lot of people that still said it's more or less just a bad decision. It's not a sign of deeper corruption. If that's the kind of opinion that takes hold in the coming weeks, then the Liberals might be able to muddle through.
Let me switch gears for a second, David, and ask you about the opposition parties during this, because when one political party loses ground, the natural question is, well, are others gaining ground at their expense? And what are your numbers showing you there?
Well, we are seeing a small uptick for the Conservatives. So if you think the 4 points left the Liberals, the Conservatives picked up about half, and then the rest got sort of spread out towards the Greens. And the NDP really hasn't benefited all that much from this. So the Conservatives have gained a little bit. Now, they're still, as Eric said, even though the Liberals have dropped 4 points, the Liberals are better in our poll anyways than they were after the last election or even coming into the pandemic. So they're still better off, and their approval rating is above water, and Mr. Trudeau's personal image is still up. But I think the point here is the scale of the impact this has had in a very short period of time. I went back and looked at we were doing daily tracking during the SNC-Lavalin controversy, and it appears to me that at worst, at least in those first few months that Shachi was referring to, the Liberals lost about 5 percentage points of their vote share, but they were starting at a much lower levels, but the relative impact was about the same. And so if this continues, I suspect it's not so much that people are looking at the Conservatives or the New Democrats and are saying, well, they're better alternatives than the Liberals. The real question is, are caucus members in the Liberal caucus asking themselves, is Justin Trudeau the right person to lead us into the next election? Because I think, 3 strikes and you're out kind of rule might be creating more internal pressure than we would see externally on, people leaving the Liberals to support another party, because there's still a lot of uncertainty among those opposition parties as well.
Shachi, what do you think on that question of, in particular, the level of support for Justin Trudeau as leader versus like that kind of internal pressure question?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of both and. I think if backbench caucus members, if the Liberal caucus writ large, we heard Andrew Scheer call on backbenchers to push the Prime Minister today. That's not going to happen. They're there on his auspices. For better or for worse, he is the party brand right now. So to me, and we've talked about this, Vashi, this is very much the next chapters of this story will be written by how effectively the Conservative Party, particularly under new leadership when that comes, is able, if it is able, to actually take advantage. David's analysis in his poll today talks a little bit about accessible Liberals, that is, people who might vote Liberal. In this case, I'd also be wondering what is happening with accessible Conservatives. So people who are unhappy with Justin Trudeau, but who in the last election voted Liberal anyway because there were just things about Andrew Scheer and his platform and the campaign he ran that simply made it impossible for them to vote Conservative. If you have a new, more moderate leader, such as a Peter MacKay, who says, look, I know that maybe you haven't always looked at the Conservative Party as a natural home, but if you're ticked off at Justin Trudeau and you're looking for somewhere else to park your vote, park it with us, come on over to us, we're a big new tent. That could prove quite devastating for the PM because it provides a viable alternative that has not really been there at the national leadership level to really challenge Mr. Trudeau to this point. If that doesn't happen, then maybe it's a question about the future. Maybe the caucus starts to ask some questions about what happens in the next election. But really, I think Liberals are also bearing the scars of what internal leadership factionalism and strife does to a party over time. Of course, the last time that happened was the big war between Mr. Chrétien and Martin, and we saw the Liberals essentially sit out the next decade of government. So I think if you have a sense that the party and the caucus feels like they can survive this and are not vulnerable to new Conservative leadership on this front, they will stick with their guy.
Okay, Eric, I just have a few seconds left, but I want to give you the last word here. If you are sort of analyzing this or looking at this in the context of does it stick? Is there further damage done in the future? Where are you watching? What are you keeping an eye on in the coming weeks?
Well, one of the biggest differences, I'd say, from the SNC-Lavalin affair was that there was always news coming out week after week, month after month. It was a story that just kept on going. If this story more or less dies after this week because everything that we know has already happened, it's already been revealed, then the damage could be pretty limited. If this does continue to leak and dribble out over the summer, that's where I think the Liberals would have much more concern going into the fall. Okay,
I'll leave it there. Thank you, all three of you. Great discussion. Really appreciate your insights this evening. Thanks to David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data, Shachi Kurl, Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute, and of course, CBC's polls analyst, Éric Grenier. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.